Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Good afternoon to all of you. Au nom du University Refugee Forum et de l'Université de Genève, je vous souhaite la bienvenue dans cette session en ligne. Je m'appelle Mathieu Crétenant, je suis délégué à l'intégration à l'Université de Genève. Étant donné l'évolution récente de la pandémie Covid, nous avons été contraints de repousser l'événement prévu à l'Institut des hautes études internationales et du développement au printemps 2022. Le University Refugee Forum est organisé par Uni4 Refugees, mais il compte avec les partenaires suivants: le bureau suisse auprès du Haut-Commissariat aux réfugiés, l'Institut des hautes études et du développement, l'Université de Zurich, l'Université de Genève avec la délégation à l'intégration et le programme INZO. L'événement d'aujourd'hui se déroulera en anglais, avec des possibilités de poser des questions également en français et en allemand via le chat du webinaire. Now I hand over to my colleague Sarah Elmer from the University of Zurich to say also some few words of welcome. Because of the snow in Switzerland, her train was stuck in between Bern and Geneva. So very sorry for you, but please, Sarah.
Kein Problem, ich bin ja zum Glück jetzt wieder zu Hause. Also auch ich heiße Sie als Vertreterin der Universität Zürich im Namen von Uni4 Refugees herzlich willkommen. Das heutige University Refugee Forum findet auf Englisch statt. Sie können aber mit der Chat-Funktion jederzeit auch Fragen und Kommentare auf Deutsch einbringen. So, ich wechsle deshalb nun auf Englisch. And I'd like to warmly welcome everyone to today's virtual edition of the University Refugee Forum 2021, organized by Uni4 Refugees. The initiative Uni4 Refugees, Broadening Diversity in Swiss Higher Education Institutions, is an initiative of 7 universities and universities of applied sciences, jointly led by the University of Geneva and University of Zurich. The overall goal of Uni4 Refugees goals are to raise awareness for the challenges exiled students and scholars are facing and to facilitate the access of refugees to higher education in Switzerland. Uni4 Refugees is supported by Swiss universities, the Fondation Philanthropique Famille Sando, the Fondation Henri Moser, the Fondation Gandour pour la Jeunesse, and the Mercator Foundation. I hand now over back to my colleague Mathieu Crétenant from the University of Geneva for introducing the topic of today.
Thank you, Sarah. The University Refugee Forum was initially thought as a forum bringing together several actors of innovation in higher education. As I said before, due to the recent evolution of COVID, we were forced to postpone the event as it was initially planned. However, as a link event to the UNHCR High-Level Officials Meeting, and also only online next week with this online session, we want to keep the link with the UNHCR agenda of the Global Compact on Refugees and with the news. And what is more relevant now than the situation in Afghanistan? And we have decided to focus the event on Afghanistan crisis and higher education, how to stay connected. Before introducing our panel of speakers, I want to share a few words about the current crisis in Afghanistan and the commitment of the University of Geneva, who has been involved for a long time with Afghan population through its integration program, Academic Horizon Academic in French. Through this program, since 2016, 50 Afghan students have been welcomed into the institution, including 17 during this academic year. The current situation in Afghanistan has put many people at risk. Among them are researchers and students who are unable to continue their activities and studies and are directly at risk because of their proximity to the former government, the nature of their research or studies, or just for the fact of being a woman. The University of Geneva, through the Scholars at Risk program, Academic Horizon, and other academic structures, is currently working hard to be able to host some Afghan researchers and students at the university. Given the difficult migration situation in Europe and Switzerland, I want to say that it's not an easy task, but it corresponds to a clearly identified need and to a strong vision of solidarity in academia. We hope that today's event will inform and raise awareness about the challenges to academic freedom and the danger to education in Afghanistan since the Taliban took control last August. In T7, to understand this issue, it's proposed to look first at a global level with the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees, and then to be more concrete with the situation in higher education in Afghanistan. To introduce the speakers, I will give now the floor to the Professor Karl Blanchet. He's director at the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Studies, professor of Humanitarian Public Health in the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Geneva. He worked until August 2021 on the development of integrated package of essential health services in Afghanistan, and is now involved in high-level discussions on the future of the health system in Afghanistan. I wish you a very nice event, and please, Karl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction of this very interesting event. So I have the pleasure and the honor to chair and facilitate the discussion between two fantastic panelists. We are very privileged to have with us Anya Klug and Heela Najibullah. We've been working at the University of Geneva on not only the future of the health system by being involved with a few Afghan colleagues who are still in the country, but as well with the United Nations agencies to try to provide some technical support on how the future health system should look like and trying to protect what already exists, and as well to try to protect the health of populations. As you know, Afghanistan is currently facing huge international sanctions, and there's a lot of risk of outbreaks, measles, cholera, and as well a high level of malnutrition in the country due to the lack of supply of food in many parts of the country. We are also very worried about the brain drain. A lot of people have left the country, and a lot of my colleagues who are researchers or are lecturers in medical schools as well, who are very important for the future of the young generations, are actually either at risk and staying at home because they fear for their safety, or have left the country. So we do think that at University of Geneva, but as well, I'm not talking about on behalf of University of Zurich, but I know we are very much aligned on this vision, that it is our duty and our responsibility as a Western university or Western universities to provide support to all our colleagues who are still facing all these challenges. To talk about higher education today in Afghanistan, but as well more globally, we have invited two fantastic speakers, and I will start with Anya Klug. Anya Klug is the head of the UNHCR Office for Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And Anya is a lawyer by training, and you have held different functions during your 25 years of career at UNHCR. You have worked on various legal and policy issues, and in the context of the interface between refugee protection and international migration. You also have been involved in the development of regional responses in different parts of the world. And so, Anya, we would like to hear from you more about, not only about Afghanistan, and probably not specifically about Afghanistan, but from you about having this global vision of what can be done and the role of UNHCR in this context. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karl. First of all, a warm welcome to everybody at this very winterly day in Geneva. And of course, many thanks to Mathieu Crétinat and the University of Geneva for organizing this discussion in support of the High-Level Officials Meeting of the Global Compact on Refugees. Let's first take a step back and see what has happened in how the Global Compact came into being. Almost 3 years ago, on December 17, 2018, the United Nations General Assembly affirmed the Global Compact on Refugees. It had been agreed upon by states half a year earlier. This was a landmark decision, particularly considering the crisis of multilateralism in which we are in currently, since it recognized that a sustainable solution to refugee situations cannot be achieved without international cooperation. The Compact provides a blueprint for governments, for international organizations, but also for other stakeholders to ensure that host communities get the support they needed and that refugees can lead productive lives. The ongoing COVID pandemic has highlighted once more the importance of the principles at the heart of the Global Compact, a spirit of solidarity to work together, to share responsibilities, and to ensure that people forced to flee are included into national responses. The Global Compact, GCR, sets out concrete measures to help meeting its objectives. These include, inter alia, a global refugee forum, which has to be convened on ministerial level every 4 years, national and regional arrangements for specific refugee situations, and tools for funding, for partnership, for data gathering and sharing. The first Global Refugee Forum, and Mathieu has already mentioned this, took place at the end of 2019. Expectations at the time were high to mobilize action towards the objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. This resulted in around 1,400 pledges, not only by states, but by a range of stakeholders and in a variety of different fields. The objective of the High-Level Officials Meeting next week on 14 and 15 December is to identify progress, challenges, and also where further engagement is needed, particularly taking into account the challenges currently posed by the pandemic. That's a very important meeting, since it's now the time to show that the Global Compact is not a piece of paper only, but that it has a concrete impact on the lives of people, and also that the GRF, the Global Refugee Forum, was not only a one-off event, but started an ongoing process towards better international cooperation and burden sharing. I would like to highlight the mechanisms of the Global Forum on the basis of 2 different fields, which are particularly relevant for our discussion today, namely education and the development of regional responses to refugee situations. It has been mentioned that we want to look at Afghanistan. Let me start with education. Let's look what GCR says on education, because it's one of the key themes that have been identified to make sure that refugees can lead meaningful lives. In the GCR, states and other stakeholders committed to contribute resources and expertise to expand and enhance the quality and the inclusiveness of national education systems for refugees. In particular, they promise to facilitate access by refugees and host community children, both boys and girls, adolescents and youth, to primary, secondary, and very importantly, also to tertiary education. The compact further recognizes the importance of measures to strengthen the agency of women and girls, to promote women's economic empowerment, and to support access by women and girls to education, again, including secondary and tertiary education. For every individual, but even more for refugees, higher education has a life-changing potential. However, for refugees, such opportunities are very, very difficult to reach. Apart from a very small portion, refugees often end up in unskilled jobs: catering, cleaning, transport. We have already heard about a brain drain. Here we can talk about brain waste. And unfortunately, this is not only elsewhere the case, but also in Europe and also in Switzerland. The latest UNHCR figures published in the 2021 education report show that refugee enrollment in higher education was at 5% worldwide. And this is already a rise in comparison to previous years. Together with partners, UNHCR has set an ambitious goal of increasing that number to 15% by 2030. But this is only possible through strong engagement, political goodwill, and obviously financial support. Based on current population data, achieving 50% enrollment in 2030 will mean that approximately 500,000 young refugee women and men will be participating in academic life. That's a dramatic contrast with the nearly 90,000 refugee learners today. At the Global Refugee Forum, 204 pledges were made on the theme of education. It was very, very passionate. I mean, there was a lot of support and a key theme, with 58 focused on higher education and spanning skills development. Of these 204 pledges today, and that will be shown next week, more than a dozen pledges have been already fulfilled, including financial commitments made to offer scholarships for refugee students. I would only like to outline one example, since we don't have the time to really go into a lot of detail, which is related to Geneva, namely the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, which was officially launched in January this year, and as I said, will be based in Geneva. There are many more examples like this. In addition to state pledges, however, and that's also extremely important, there have been significant pledges made by civil society. In particular, there has been a strong focus on advocacy efforts, taking into account COVID-19 related school closures and placing a strong focus on ensuring inclusion of refugees in national plans. Let me now move on to Afghanistan. In 2012, the Islamic Republics of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, with the support of UNHCR, developed the solutions strategy for Afghan refugees to support voluntary repatriation, sustainable reintegration, and assistance to host countries, SSAR. And subsequently, activities had taken place to implement the SSR. The GCR, however, boosted these efforts. As I have mentioned earlier, the GCR created several support platforms to provide situation-specific support. One of them was a solutions platform for the SSAR. The platform has since served as an enabling multilateral forum for consensus building, strengthening existing partnerships, and engaging new actors. More than 60 government agencies, humanitarian development actors, UN agencies and NGOs, and in brackets also Switzerland, have been engaged in its implementation to date. The synergies created through this multi-stakeholder approach help to ensure complementarity of responses, avoid duplication of efforts, and maximize outputs. These are only 2 examples out of the different areas where the Global Compact intends to bring progress. We very much hope that the high-level officials meeting next week will provide evidence of the progress achieved and steer more international action to continue the path which has been started in 2019. I thank you very much for listening to my small presentation, and I'm open to questions that may come in the discussions.
Thank you very much, Anya. Thank you very much for this clear presentation. I have a few questions for you, and I also would like to remind everybody that after the 2 talks, the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions, and you can use the Q&A function of the Zoom to ask your question by chat. So do not hesitate to use the chat function of this Zoom webinar. But Anya, so I'm also the academic director of InZone, which is the University of Geneva program for delivering academic programs to refugees in Kenya and Jordan, and very soon in Niger. And we always have the difficulty to find the right funding and to convince people on the value of higher education for refugees. So how would you describe that? And maybe you could help us to have a better arguments. So at UNHCR, what are your arguments for valuing higher education for refugees?
I think it's not very difficult to really to argue that point. And I would like to put forward 3 different arguments. I mean, one, it's very clear that quality education is crucial for the self-reliance of refugees. Quality education is very often the entry door for good employment opportunities. But on the other hand, it's also central for the development of the communities which have welcomed refugees, because refugees who have a good education, find a good profession, obviously they can contribute a lot better to the prosperity of their host countries. And if return is one day possible, obviously also on the prosperity of their countries of origin. But I also find important that education provides refugees with a voice and enables them to bring forward their own agendas. It turns, so to speak, students into leaders. It helps to develop critical skills for decision making, for amplifying their voices, and for enabling change. And that's also extremely important, because oftentimes we see that refugees do not have the possibility to really voice their views, their support, their input. And like this, I think education can make a very big difference in enhancing the participation of refugees in decision-making processes.
Thank you, Anya. From 90,000 refugees who today have access to universities and higher education, to 500,000, as you mentioned earlier, the task is huge. And how do you think UNHCR is going to increase their involvement in higher education? How is that going to happen? And how can we as partners of UNHCR, we can contribute to that?
Very good question, a very ambitious goal for sure. But I have to say that we have already managed to make some progress. During the past years, we have seen enrollment in higher education mounting 2% per year. And I think a very important step that has been made already is to increase awareness for the importance of education. And for the importance of education, not only once refugees have settled and everything is going forward, but education early on in difficult humanitarian situations. So I think there we have already, during the past years, made quite a bit of progress. But we have then now, in the context of the GCR, developed together with a network of partners a strategic roadmap to support the progress towards this, what we call 15 by 30 target. And this roadmap is built around 5 higher education pathways, which offer strategies for optimizing coordination and expanding opportunities. These pathways include national university involvement, connected higher education programs, UNHCR tertiary education scholarships, and complementary education pathways for admission to third countries, like the program you mentioned in Switzerland, Scholars at Risk, where we try to raise also awareness here in Switzerland. We have a little portrait of the Scholars at Risk on our UNHCR website for Switzerland.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anja. The Global Compact for Refugees should not be only a document. It has been more than that. It has been for us as academic, a real roadmap, and as well a very, very good justification why we should be involved on these issues. But how do you see the Global Compact be useful for the Afghanistan situation? How would you see that having an impact on access to higher education for the young generation, and more specifically for female students?
I'm very happy to hear that you attached a lot of importance to the Global Compact on Refugees, because that's exactly what we want to achieve with the Compact. It's not only an instrument for states and an action plan commitments by states, but we realize that real improvement and change can only be made if we include all stakeholders. So it's very important to have universities as yours included. I have already outlined before that education is a key theme of the Global Compact. And it was also highlighted as a priority area during the Global Forum. So as mentioned before, I don't want to repeat this, we have made quite a number of pledges have been made. I mean, awareness has been raised, pledges have been made, follow-up processes have been put in place, such as what I just mentioned, the contribution by the Swiss government, the Geneva Hub for Education in Emergencies. Again, what I mentioned before, very important to realize that education does not only have a place in times of peace, but in time when everything is working well, but that we have to move on very early on, include in education into our strategies.
Thank you very much. And I'm well aware as well that UNHCR has been at the core of a network of universities in the world, and the University of Geneva is part of that as well, who have offered courses and free access to courses to a wide range of populations. And UNHCR has been a facilitator to make sure that universities can work together, but as well they can have access to populations, or populations can have access to these courses. So thank you very much for all your work and all the support you have provided to our network and the in-zone and our universities.
I think it was of mutual interest, and I mean, we can see the results are very, very good.
Absolutely. And I think there's one already reaction on the chat. And I do think that the combination of civil society, United Nations, government, and universities is rich and has generated a lot of benefits for populations, but as well for us academics.
Yeah, and I have to say it's also a very interesting development of international law, because I mean, when I started, law school, this was absolutely, I mean, actors were governments, and what we now see, not only in our field but also here, that other stakeholders really become a much more important role for framing international action and also for developing international standards.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would like to go to Heela Najibullah now, and but before I introduce you, I would like to say a few words about how universities in the world, and University of Geneva and Zurich have been at the forefront of that, and have been at the forefront because we had to adapt to a new context, and our students have been forced to actually adapt as well their way of learning. But as a benefit, as an opportunity, we have been able to create a lot of courses that are now available online. And I do think that that's very rich. We also have learned, and I've been the first to learn how to use these online tools and these online learning tools and teaching tools. That has been a huge learning curve, and I can't believe you don't believe how much adaptation has been made. But at the end, we have quality courses, and these courses can now be made available to people who can be located anywhere in the world, and that's fantastic. And these technologies and teaching methods as well have been so incredibly innovative. I do think that are new opportunities for working remotely. In my field, in health, we have used for the last, I would say, a few years, and we have improved a lot, telemedicine. I do think we also have these kind of opportunities, and we have learned how to use this kind of remote tools to provide quality advice and quality support to medical teams. So I do think there's some parallel to make it here. And I do think now we are much better equipped to work in some of the remote places. And I'm thinking about today, Afghanistan, of course, that's the topic of our webinar, but as well, I'm thinking about Syria, I'm thinking about Yemen, places where the young generation is stranded and stuck, and having them online sometimes for our events and webinars has been tremendously very useful to provide some insight on some of the most challenging environments. Heela Najibullah, you are doing your PhD at University of Zurich at the Religious Studies Department, and you graduated with a master in peace, conflict, transformation, and security studies. And but not only that, even before working on your PhD, you wrote a book. You wrote a book on reconciliation and social healing in Afghanistan. And you have worked on migration issues with the International Federation of the Red Cross, who is a very good partner of us. And it's a very privilege to have you for this webinar and to talk to us about higher education in Afghanistan and to give us some insight of what is going on today in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Blanchett and University of Geneva in Zurich for allowing me to give my viewpoints about Afghanistan, specifically on higher education. Since the issue was about Refugee Forum, I just thought I would start with the fact that UNHCR in mid-2021 had reported that there are 84 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And if one puts together this number, it's basically the 17th most populated nation in the world. On 3rd of December 2021, the Office of the European Asylum Support in a press release mentioned that since September, the number of Afghans seeking protection in the EU alone has increased 72%. So I'm not even mentioning the Afghans who've ended up in the United States or in the neighboring countries or who are IDPs. There are about 48 million IDPs according to IDMC, and 3.5 million of them are in Afghanistan. So if anything, our humanitarian approach and international legal measures, they've been tested with these new changing trends and difficulties, be it with restrictive policies of the global north, the increasing number of IDPs, the relabeling of terminologies to restrict the flee of those who need protection and are on the want to leave the country because of fear of prosecution, or they're forced to stay within their own countries, and their situations, especially even in the case of Afghanistan, where authorities are colluded to restrict the movement of people and even closing the borders. Now, Afghanistan is a good example demonstrating the current challenges when it comes to refugees, because it's been a continued exodus of Afghans in a very mobile nature of being displaced since the Cold War. There have been almost 4 phases that the Afghans have become refugees. Some have returned back, some have stayed where they were resettled. And this trend has been going on, and the events of August of 2021 is another indicator of how this trend is ongoing. So Afghanistan in South Asia, which is another interesting point that I would like to make, is the only country signatory to 1951 Geneva Convention. And yet there are restrictions for implementing asylum and refugee law. So I was pretty much interested about this multilateral mechanism that was mentioned that UNHCR had with Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, because that is currently sort of non-functional in the sense that either Afghans are forcefully returned, or the borders are closed for Afghans who want to leave the country and seek asylum, or, for example, even to get visas to come and study abroad through Pakistan or Iran. And also India was another country which did not, provide any kind of visas for Afghans. And even though they'd mentioned that they would provide emergency visas, that was also not taken into consideration post the crisis of August 15th. So what Afghans are facing is an oscillation between unknown and uncertainty, a violation of their basic rights, such as access to education, healthcare, food, especially for women and children of the country who are at the highest risk. A sense of hopelessness is looming on the lives and future of individuals, the youth, the children, the infants. And the perils of intercepting this education in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule are manifold. For example, the Taliban have banned schools for girls. They do not allow education after primary schools. Access to higher education is shut, with the exception of the private institutions. A few weeks ago, it was announced that last year students of colleges, so the ones who are in their last year of education, are allowed to take the examination by the end of the year, but then that the Taliban interim government will decide whether the students can go back to the higher education by next year, when the education year is supposed to start. So that is March of 2022. So at the moment, you do not have the possibility to continue your higher education in Afghanistan unless you're enrolled in a private institution. That also, for women, you need to be accompanied by a chaperone. It's gender segregated, and they've been asked to review the curriculum. Also, what needs to be taken into consideration that most of the education centers that Afghanistan has remain closed, the public ones. However, there are attempts to create or to fund religious madrasas in the different provinces of Afghanistan. Yesterday, there was, for example, a news about a Haqqani madrasa being founded in the Paktia province to continue with Islamic studies. So Taliban are creating fertile ground with their extremist behavior, actions, and policy of revenge, killing, extreme Islamic interpretation. And if I may so say that invented rules according to Sharia law, which in absence of an alternative space for education will be extremely dangerous for the global society at large, but for Afghans, new generations to come. And if I may highlight here, the UNESCO manifesto starts that if wars are created in the minds of the people, then what is it? What is our role in shaping the future minds of our world and ensuring that we pass on a more peaceful and aware society to the future generations? And that includes that of Afghanistan. So I urge and request the international community, the academic and humanitarian community, to first provide possibilities for Afghan asylum seekers to pursue their education when they arrive in the countries. There are cases, even for example, in Switzerland, I came across some asylum seekers who were not even allowed to study or the language. They were only allowed to study up to A2 of the local language until and unless they didn't have an F permit. So, so these are the nature of rules and regulations in the West that do create a difficult and sort of restrictive atmosphere for refugees to build their capacities and be of any kind of benefit for a society at large. If anything, the pandemic did prove that the online education, as you were saying, Professor Blanchette, and home office is possible. And the fact that Afghans still have access to internet in Afghanistan, especially girls who are not allowed to study and go to school, can have access to education online. How can this be done? So humanitarian organizations that are working with IDPs or refugees can provide online education in the camps, distribution centers, or even find ways to negotiate with the authorities and have this as conditional a way to provide humanitarian assistance, because at the end of the day, this is a right that is being taken away from the Afghans. UNHCR under the Global Compact and pursuing the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals can focus on how to ensure that 17 populated countries in the world can have access to education so they become functioning part of the society rather than a vulnerable group dependent on aid. What I would like to mention also here that in the past 20 years, despite of the aid and the support of the Western countries to Afghanistan, the higher education system and universities only had possibility to obtain a bachelor and in the past 4 years, a master's degrees in Afghanistan. Today, the possibility for Afghan students who maybe did their master's program, and to pursue their PhDs are basically none, which was the case, for example, earlier on before the collapse of the Afghan government, where they were given scholarships to go abroad and continue with their PhD or research. And I see more Afghans that I was in touch with in the country who wanted to pursue their PhDs right now are looking for grants and possibilities to go abroad because they don't have that possibility inside the country. So the universities that have accepted scholars at risk or PhD scholars must be also assisted or seek assistance by the correspondent embassies to allow visas to be issued, since majority of the embassies are not within Afghanistan. And for students to get visas, they have to travel either to Pakistan or Iran to get their visas issued. Last but not the least, education is a fundamental right of every individual. And I know that Afghans being thirsty for education and knowledge, especially Afghan girls as a humanitarian community, we have to pursue that sustainable development goals and empower future women and mothers of the world. And the platforms, creative, innovative platforms that were mentioned needs to be, created further by bringing universities around the world to educate vulnerable societies, because at the end of the day, if one puts it from the northern perspective, the refugees who will have access to education will probably be helpful in the societies in the West as well. So for now, I would like to conclude here that we all do have a responsibility, and the situation in Afghanistan is such for universities that the institutions are decaying as the days go by, because the teachers, some are under life threat, so they're in hiding or they're sitting at home. Others are not given salaries. There is no way to continue a form of education, and then the students are basically, you know, are not allowed to continue with the old curriculum, to an extent that the interim minister of the higher education even said that those people who had degrees from the past will not be considered, you know, their degrees will not be considered, and therefore it's really not important to continue with your education. So given the circumstances, this is as much of a political and a humanitarian crisis, which I think we as different entities can come together and address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heela, and thank you very much for this very much insight from Afghanistan and about Afghanistan. Very, very helpful. I do remember you talk about thirst for knowledge, and I do remember that the first images we saw from September were these students, female and male students, separated by a curtain. I don't know if you remember, but it was at university. And they were still going. They said, okay, no, we continue. We're going to continue to learn. We're going to continue to read, and we want to get access to all these courses. So that's incredibly inspiring for all of us. The visa issue you're talking about, I'm so, how do you say that? Shameful, I can say that about European countries, not doing enough to protect scholars, and specifically scholars at risk, and to really help us as universities to be able to host these scholars whose life is at risk, and to offer them an environment so that they can continue their work, they can continue the research, they can continue the teaching. You do not believe how many obstacles we have to be able to offer that. Is highly complicated. And I just wonder if it's only Europe, if you have heard about other countries in the region, for example, who have been more welcome to scholars, Heela?
No, sadly. So the scenario that you're talking about, women going to the universities, were mostly private, and none of the public universities have been open for women and girls. So anyway, that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And the issue of the fact whether other countries in the region have been, you know, helpful. I haven't come across such cases. At least the Afghans that I've been in touch with are all finding it very difficult to even access visas to get eventually to Europe, or even to continue their education in India, or you know, if they were in Iran or other places like Malaysia. In India, for example, since 2005, the country had given almost every year 500 scholarships to Afghans to go study their masters and PhDs, even bachelor degrees. And post-fall of the Afghan government, the visas were canceled. The previous visas were canceled, and you know, they were asked to reapply for emergency visas, which were never issued really. So there are many Afghan scholars who, for example, stuck and are not able to go to India. And similarly, you have the same situation, you know, for Afghans in the United States who had access to Fulbright, I think, awards, and that was not announced post the Taliban takeover. So these are some of the difficulties for those who want to continue their education. And for me, it's really interesting because You see, unless this is an intentional decision, Afghans who would like to study at the end of the day would be beneficial if they go back to their country, no matter who is ruling it. And if they don't go back to their country and they stay in the Western countries, if you've got educated class of citizens, they will be beneficial for your society. So for me, it doesn't make sense why we have such a difficulty in ensuring that these scholars are helped and assisted.
Absolutely. I mean, you rightfully put us in front of our responsibilities as a European or Swiss university or Swiss universities. University is such a place where you have freedom of speech. This is where you learn about critical thinking, you learn about diversity, you learn about being in contact with your peers, but as well the rest of the world. And there can be networks, there can be other universities. It's such a beautiful opportunity. Sorry, that the inconvenience of working from home and being stuck by the snow. As a university, I mean, what can we do? University of Zurich and Geneva and others who are going to listen to this webinar. How can we support Afghan students? And how do you see today in this modern teaching world how we can actually provide support to universities in Afghanistan? And I know there is a lot of universities, private or public, and I know actually salaries as well are not paid because they don't have access to cash. So that's another issue for all our colleagues and peers who work in Afghanistan. But today, I mean, if you have to give some recommendation to University of Geneva and Zurich, for example, and other universities, what would you recommend?
I mean, to start with, for some understanding of the situation on the ground, there are student unions, for example, from different universities in Afghanistan, that one could have a webinar and have a discussion with them about the difficulties they face and what could be done. So for you to really have people on the ground telling you, because some of them I'm in touch with. And this could be a good advocacy, people to people, sort of awareness raising. And I'm sure that student unions in Switzerland would like to do something like this. So this is one. The second thing is that in terms of the, what was really interesting about 2 years ago for primary and secondary education, there are these two local NGOs at grassroots level, and one of them is called Learn Afghanistan, whose director and founder is right now in the US. And she was basically going to the conflict-affected areas of Afghanistan and providing education through iPads and electronics to children. This is possible if, for example, girls are not allowed to go and study in public universities. How can one negotiate with the government so they could have access to education online? How could universities in the West allow degrees to be given for refugees that are not in their countries, that are maybe in the camps in Lebanon, or, for example, are sitting in Afghanistan and want to, by within Afghanistan, I don't mean refugees, but IDPs as well, right? So this is another way of dealing with this situation, because some of the universities might not be able to have the know-how or the system to be able to provide this online education with the degrees to people who are in the outside the borders. How could this be done? I mean, although, for example, when I was studying, there are certain courses that were on-site in University of Innsbruck that I would go for 2 months, so I didn't need a year visa. And then the rest of it I would do online. So could those kind of situations be created, or could it be completely online studies and then at the end you could give a degree? And the third thing that I have experience being a humanitarian worker is that most of the local staff, any of the organizations that are on the ground right now, and the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is really becoming intense, but their staff are usually the educated young population that would like to pursue with their education. They do learn languages, they do have access to internet and sort of an international community. So how could these international organizations or international NGOs able to provide higher education to their staff if they wish to do so? I think this is also, these are the three things that immediately come to my mind. But it is also, I must say that allowing girls to go to schools beyond primary education, even the notion of giving higher education possibility is as crucial, because if a woman is not allowed to do so, then you have possibilities for young mothers, for underage marriage, and then the cycle of what happens when we don't empower girls and they get into young marriages and no education, and overall, how does that impact our human security and peaceful societies?
Thank you very much, Heela. And I'm proud to say that at University of Geneva, we have created a specific certificate of open studies for refugees, exactly for what you're saying. We are going to launch in 2022 with InZone, that in order to increase access to the university degrees for refugee populations and displaced populations, because it's actually for migrants in general. So I would like to open the floor to
Sorry, Professor Blanchard, if I may add one more thing. Please. As we speak today, the World University Service is also launching an Afghan Exile University, which is going to be online. How that is, come about, what's the structure of it, I don't know, because I haven't really attended the meeting, but that's another example of how one could specifically ensure that you have scholars, Afghan scholars from different backgrounds, to teach the Afghans who will be then having access to education online. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Fantastic. So thank you to you two, Anya and Heela, for these very inspiring talks and words. Valeria, I'm going to leave the floor to you so you can facilitate and get questions from the audience. Please.
Thank you, Carol. So we have a first question about online education, which has been already talked about, but the question is more on how could you improve the fundings and the scholarships for Afghanistan students who still are in Afghanistan and need to follow these online courses?
Is that for me? Is that question for me?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to.
Or maybe Anya, because she's with UNHCR and I'm a PhD student. So
No, sure, I'm happy to take that question. As I have mentioned, I mean, our education, the goal of our education strategy is indeed to improve funding of scholarship, and that will be one of the issues that will come up next week in the high-level officials meeting. As I said, some progress has been made, not specifically, obviously, to Afghanistan, because that's very new development, but globally, because, I mean, we have many other refugee situations where people have refugees, even those, who have difficulties accessing higher education. So that's exactly the goal of this education strategy, which has been given a push through the Global Forum to find funding opportunities.
Thank you, Anya. And a second question, which is linked to this first one, is there still a risk for Afghanistan students with online education? Maybe Heela?
Yeah, so at the moment, you know, one of the things that happened post the collapse of the Afghan government is that there was monitoring of, you know, phones and social media. And even if you are caught with certain personal pictures that are not, you know, liked by the Taliban, you get harassed and beaten and taken to prison. So point I'm making that because there are no laws right now, and because everybody's told to wait on the education issue, you know, if one does not have a legally binding or agreed negotiated term with the government on this issue, then there will be risks for sure. This is why in my talk I said you need to have conditions. When you go with your humanitarian assistance and sit to help the Afghans, you need to negotiate this with the authorities. And this needs to be done at the international level, whether it's UNHCR and the UN, and through the mechanisms that they could perhaps set up as to how they would engage with the Afghan current authority.
May I just add to this conditionality? I mean, for us, obviously, first humanitarian aid is always given without any conditionality, you know, like, you know, really the first needs of people. But then indeed, we are calling for on states to start a dialogue with the Taliban, not you know, to make sure that the governmental structures are not completely collapsing because of lack of financial support, but indeed there we also call for, you know, using these opportunities to address the most pertinent issues. And for us, the situation of women is on top of the agenda. I mean, we have also decided, you might have seen this, to maintain our representative, who is a woman of color. I mean, it's not easy for her to be at the current time in Afghanistan, but to keep her there to make the point to that, you know, women have their place also in leading positions in UNHCR, and we are not willing to step back.
Thank you. The next question is really linked to what you already said about these plans to protect women scholars. And there is a question in the chat, especially about scholars at risk. So is there actually another program or another project to, besides scholars at risk, to help Afghan researchers?
Again, I would like to respond to the question more generally, because we not only work for Afghans in need of education, but every refugee, obviously. And I mean, on the global level, I haven't talked about this because I've really focused on education and on, you know, the SSAR as a regional platform. But one other very important area of the Global Compact is strengthening legal pathways to safety, so to speak. For us, one important is the resettlement program. But we more and more realize that the resettlement program is not sufficient because it focuses on refugees, on very vulnerable refugees. The people we are talking about often don't have access to resettlement opportunities because they are not among the most vulnerable population of a refugee situation. Mostly, I mean, because they are young, you know, they have some possibilities. So we are calling for what we call complementary pathways, in different complementary pathways, but including those that, you know, provide access to education, like scholarships and visa, exactly the problem that Heela mentioned, we would like to address. And also obviously to work opportunities. So that's a part, it's in the Global Compact. There's a big push. There's also a strategy related exactly to that part of the Global Compact, led by another part of UNHCR. And I have to say, for me, it's also personally being responsible for UNHCR's operation here in Switzerland, as small as it is, it's extremely important to push this topic forward. And I can tell you that I started some initiatives also with the Swiss universities. 2015, when we had the so-called refugee crisis, and we had a lot of Syrians, also, highly educated people, exactly same situation, cut off, on sometimes, from studies they had started in Syria, very suddenly. So I started discussions there, and I have to say there was a lot of goodwill, but very little awareness at the time, and very little action, and a lot of question marks. I think we are quite a step forward, especially if I hear what Carl has been talking about, and Matthew also mentioned something in the beginning with regard to universities, because obviously they are a very important actor. I also have to say, I do think that there are, also the Swiss government has been moving, because from 2015, I have to say, it was almost a no-go to us to look at these things. There are still lots of obstacles. We are not there yet, but they've just commissioned a study. They are thinking about, complementary pathways, and they have come across also to us, to the Scholars at Risk program, which they find interesting, And I have just heard that the program has also received funding from the Swiss National Fund, so that's great. So I think it's very important to push, globally, but also in Switzerland, to bring, to highlight also what Heela has said, the opportunities that these people bring to the Swiss society, where skilled people are highly needed. And I think we have to continue working on this, and we really need the universities. UNHCR, we are very small actor. We need the universities to help us pushing, and we need creative thinking as the one that, in Geneva, and we know that some other universities have started, but it might be also, it might be good to come together so that we can bring in these good initiatives that sometimes the federal government is not even aware of, to show that action has been taken, that universities are behind this, and are pushing to and are interested in having students and scholars from refugee situations.
Please, Anya, keep pushing, and we can push with you.
So let's talk afterwards, because I would like to join our energies and forces.
I wanted to, Valeria, if you don't mind, I just wanted to step in. We've been working a lot on the Syria situation, the war in Syria, and in public health, we have created a network of Syrian scholars and specialists and experts who are now in the diaspora. And as the question for Heela, the Afghanistan crisis is not new. That's not August 2021. There are a lot of very highly educated Afghans everywhere in the world. And I want to know about the involvement of the diaspora to support universities as well, or to help us. But what has been the role of the Afghan diaspora on this?
Well, so this is really an interesting and close to my heart question, considering I'm spending most of my time doing my PhD on this. So the diaspora, since the fall of the Afghan government, has been very active. And some by doing advocacy, and because they do have families back in Afghanistan, and trying to, inform other countries, populations about what's going on in Afghanistan, that this was not a choice that the Afghans had made, and then some of the misinformation that's been given by the media. So this is one role of diaspora. The other role, for example, in the United States that has happened is the fact that they are trying to help the Afghans who've just arrived, through this evacuation that really didn't go very well. So a lot of their humanitarian needs, a lot of their paperwork, a lot of their, advice from the lawyers, it's been happening by these Afghan diaspora in the US. In Europe, for example, at the University of Zurich, they, about 2 years ago, a group of Afghan young students who have grown up in Switzerland founded an Afghan student association, and they have been doing events around in Lausanne, in Basel, in here, and trying to inform students, and also say that what needs to happen is for Afghan refugees to come to Switzerland, or their family members to come, that there needs to be a quota for Afghans to be able to be accepted. So these kind of advocacy. And when it comes to higher education, I have been basically saying that what we need is more, rigorous kind of interaction between those Afghans who've just come, but those that are also at the universities in Afghanistan, for students and student unions in the University of Switzerland to know about it, and perhaps create a sort of a platform that could be useful for a UNHCR to do a case study and give it to other countries, to involve universities, or to be able to come up with online platforms for the education to take place amongst the IDPs in the countries who haven't left. So this is the issue. And then one more thing that I would like to highlight about the diaspora, because when I was working post-2015 on migration issues with the Red Cross, the narrative of the fact that this cultural difference, that the terrorists are here, that they're here to take away our culture, and I like to emphasize this, that the majority of Afghans themselves are victims of the same kind of radical Islam, that they come in and try to take shelter here. And if anything, I found out through my research is that the second generation, if the first one have not been able to find a way into the society because of either language, or because they were seen as refugees, or because of whatever reasons, the second generations have been able to integrate themselves very well. And this is possible. They work for the government of Switzerland, they work for the businesses, they work for the insurances. So you have an example, a possibility to showcase that they could be very beneficial for your societies, irrespective of what the narrative of Islamic fundamentalism is.
Valeria, other questions online?
We do have other questions about the Afghan refugees who are in the neighboring countries, where education, higher education could itself be a problem. So what could be done at the level of the state and at the level of education institutions to advocate for the right for education, also for Afghan refugees?
If I may add, so we are engaging into a discourse with the Taliban. This is where you do have the possibility to discuss what could be done in terms of higher education, and how the international community would assist. One. Second of all, for Afghan refugees in the region. Now, I'll give you an example of India, because I used to live there and I used to work there, so I know it very well. When the COVID crisis happened in April of 2021, there are about 20,000 Afghans in Delhi alone. And majority of them are waiting for more than 50 years although have been given asylum by UNHCR, but waiting for more than 15 years to be resettled. And while they are in this limbo situation, they don't have access to education. They're not given any form of or platform to continue their education. So what can UNHCR do about situations like this? The other thing is that Ms. Klug said right now that there was a multilateral mechanism that came about between Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. How can higher education through this multilateral mechanism be, discussed and made a higher priority? Because, for example, throughout the 30 years of Afghans leaving to Iran and coming back, they were never allowed to access education legally. In Pakistan, it was a bit different. So what you already have this mechanism, but how do we prioritize the higher education if we really want to target the 17th populated country in the world, which I would call the displaced population, to be integrated at some point economically, socially, and politically? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And national laws, and yeah, you know about that because UNHCR is lobbying for having more open laws for refugees. They vary from one country to another. Right to education, right to work, and then in zone we have, for example, we are working in Kenya where refugees have not the right to work, for example. So then we provide access to higher education, but for what? What is it for? I cannot work with that. Or should I live abroad? Or is it knowledge and skills that I can use when I go back home or something like that? So it raises a lot of questions about the legal environment. And I'm sure Anya knows about that very well from many, many countries. But it depends from one country to another.
I mean, yes, you're right and you're not right. That I have to say as a lawyer, because obviously our legal framework as international organization, and that's a framework binding on states as well, is the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention plus international human rights law, which, for example, the Geneva Convention provides a right to access the labor market for refugees. It's just not implemented in many states. Even in states signatory to the convention like Kenya. So, I mean, but then you have international human rights law. So there are arguments, from international law which can be put forward. Still, obviously, there's always, you need a state, deciding that to implement these laws, whether it's international or national laws, because we have also in many countries very good national laws, but they are not implemented in practice. So that's something that we have to address. But for us, that's one of the key objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees, to enhance solidarity, to make sure that those situations where we have refugees confined into camps and to doing nothing for generations sometimes are being changed. So that they can, what is really very, that's not an issue as such in Europe. In Europe, refugees have a difficult but a path to integration. In other countries, it's not the case. So that mindsets are being changed. Also beyond Europe, countries see the potential and the benefits for themselves for allowing refugees to have access to education, have access to work, and implement what they have committed to on international level.
Thank you. So Valeria, maybe now it's time to close the debate, but I just wanted to highlight, and someone called Javad as online has rightly written that that Afghan students cannot be at ease to study if they are in an empty stomach. Okay. And that's very true. Today, there's a huge humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. People do not have access to food. Healthcare has been highly reduced in many, many provinces. And we have a lot of concerns on many aspects related to not only to access to basic services, but as well for the safety of the population or some group of the population in Afghanistan. You're absolutely right, Jawad, when you said it's important that we resolve the humanitarian issues first, and then maybe to start putting in place a more, how do you say that, supportive environment for the population. That's absolutely correct.
No,
As a matter of fact,
Carl, I have to, because there are some lessons learned that we had, because this was just until very recently, the message. First, obviously you cannot go to school if you're hungry, for sure. Yeah. But we should do things in parallel, because if you first address the humanitarian situation, that might take years, and decades. And that we have seen is not useful.
Exactly, and this is exactly what I wanted to say. It's actually that. Thank you, Anya. So while people are trying to negotiate access to populations and making sure that humanitarian aid assistance can enter the country in terms of healthcare and in terms of food, for example, actually negotiations have already started at all levels, and education from day one from UNICEF, UNHCR, and know that you were already negotiating access to schools and universities for every category of population. And that's very important, that education has been prioritized from day one at every level in the country. And I do think that UNHCR and UNICEF were at the forefront of this aspect, and that's very very encouraging. There's a lot of, as Heela said, and there's a lot of forces in Europe and in Switzerland, people who have been highly skilled and who can actually support universities in the country and students in the country. So I do think that we need to bring some coordination and some synergies about what is going on, and to support each other and join forces in zone. Universities of Zurich and Geneva can actually also could go hand in hand with UNHCR on these aspects, and really not only advocate, but as well put in place programs that are accessible to everybody. So I think that's important. Scholarships, visas are very important as well for all these scholars. And so I do think there's a lot of initiative in Switzerland and beyond that. I think that it's important that we highlight that, and that making sure that this information is available to all the scholars and the students. And that's important that we make sure that we work in the press. So I do think that, Heela, you need to go to the press and as well, because you've got such strong messages, and that's important that the public in Switzerland hear that. That would be very, very inspiring for many of us and many other peers. I thank you very much, Anya and Heela, for being with us and sharing your expertise and your experience. Is so enlightening. And thank you, Valeria, for helping us for the Q&A session. I leave the floor to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So on behalf of the organizing team, I would also like to express my sincere thanks to our outstanding speakers, Heela Najibullah, Anya Klug, and Karl Blanchet. So thank you very, very much for this stimulating and thought-provoking presentations and your discussion contributions. And of course, also thank you very much to the audience for being here with us today and for your contributions to the discussion. Just for your information, today's roundtable discussion has been recorded and will be shared with you by email and as well on the Uni4Refugees website very soon. And as said at the beginning, today this was the online edition of the 2021 University Refugee Forum. The originally planned a bit more comprehensive University Refugee Forum needed to be postponed to next spring due to the recent developments of the pandemic. But we will soon communicate the new date for this on-site event, and hope to welcome you all again in spring for the next University Refugee Forum on the topic Reconnect, lifelong learning, integration, and higher education. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.